Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Serious, eerie towns, disappearing diners, and creepy gas stations. What's your true, unexplained story of being in a place that shouldn't exist? Episode 6. I was in my early 20s on a Greyhound bus from Adelaide to Brisbane, a 48-hour trip. It's a long time since I was stuck on a bus with 30-odd strangers, and 25 years ago I didn't even have a Walkman. So about 36 hours into the trip I'd lost all sense of time, and we pulled into a service station at maybe 2 a.m. The place was dusty and dark, and this creepy building loomed over us like an enormous, shapeless boulder. Inside was completely silent and no one spoke, being 30 sleepy strangers, I suppose. A black and white film was playing without sound in the center, and as I couldn't find a cashier, I picked out a chocolate bar and sat and watched the film, feeling completely weirded out. The next morning, I arrived in Brisbane and for the next 10 or so years thought I'd dreamt of the rest stop. Turns out it was legit, made by two old TV personalities called the Leland brothers. It was a stupid replica of Australia's largest rock, Uluru. Last week it burnt down. I was about 9 or 10 when this happened. At the time we were looking for houses and my father was interested in owning a farmstead, and in Illinois there's quite a number of farms. We were trying to find this one acreage that was out in the middle of nowhere. And we got lost since there was no connection anywhere, so we just started wandering until we found this cute small town. The town looked and felt like one of those touristy places that's kind of Western themed, and with this nice little dinosaur pizzeria, feels kind of like Wall Drug in SD. Everything was all right as far as I remember, all I cared about was the dinosaur TPH, and we got directions or something and stumbled upon this nice, and rather large, estate that seemed abandoned because all the buildings were kind of falling apart. It was a cool place, I'll admit. There were several barns, a nice house, horse stables, a little windmill, a silo, all the things you'd imagine to be on a typical farm. Although it was really run down and everything, we still decided to explore. It was cool and all, but there were dead cats everywhere. Went through the stables and there were cat skeletons littered around, and with some still rotting away. It was pretty disturbing to say the least. But there were still a bunch of live cats roaming around in the barns and other places, just seemed they were going to die in the stables. We kept on exploring, a pretty desensitized family, so it didn't bother us too much. Although, there is one thing that bothered the most, the barn. There were 3 barns, one was totally collapsed, one the cat seemed to have lived in, and the other was empty. The first 2 were okay in my book, but the empty one just had me. At the time I was trying to get over those god-awful nightmares I'd have, and I had one that was just kind of a still image of some dark, old, wooden room, and at the end of it was this X. It sounds plain when I describe it. But that room would always be there at the end of every horrific nightmare I'd get, and would you know it, that's what the last barn was. I freaked out. I frantically tried to tell my mother not to go in, but she'd just smile and tried to get me to come in and that it was okay. I don't remember too much of what happened after, but whenever I try to ask about the farmstead, they would either say, "I don't know," or they'd completely ignore it. When I was driving cross-country to Texas a few years back, we were somewhere in the middle of Kentucky when I passed out for a bit. I dreamt of a few winding freeways, road signs, and just general mundane things. After I woke up from this restless 30-minute sleep though, I began noticing the exact same road signs as were in my dream, and in the exact same order. I've been able to rationalize this as simple déjà vu brought on by light sleep deprivation and a departure from familiar surroundings, but still, it felt so bizarre while it was happening. Like I could literally predict the upcoming town/off-ramp names, or at least I thought I could. Eerie, this isn't nearly as creepy as some of the stories here. But it's all I've got. Not so much a creepy village, just a strange coincidence. 3 of us were down in the French Alps cycling at the end of June. Staying in a little chalet, I was constantly drawn to a church/chapel high up on an outcrop on the other side of the valley. No idea why, I'm not religious. But I really wanted to go and see it. Meanwhile, one of the guys with us can smoke on and off. He'll go months or years without a cigarette, smoke a few, then nothing for months. All week he'd been moaning that he wanted some cigarettes but refused to give in and buy a pack. Over the days this progressed to, I just want 3, if I buy a pack I'll just throw the rest away. This became a theme. On the penultimate day, whilst recceing the upcoming Tour de France stage route, we drove right past the church. I get us to stop so we can go and look at this place, you know, we're here anyway. The church is down through a small hamlet and up behind a house. A really rocky and steep dirt path leads to it. Hardly easy access. Up at the church we're milling about, taking pictures, when my mate shouts, "I don't believe it." He walks back around from the church front carrying a cigarette packet, with just 3 cigarettes in it. It had been just sitting there on the church steps. Not creepy, I know, it was simply weird. He'd been wanting 3 cigarettes all week and I'd been being drawn here all week. My parents owned some land in very rural Colorado, and I would use it to camp on sometimes because it's free camping, so why not? Occasionally I would invite friends to come with me, and nothing strange had happened before this incident. Due to circumstances my friend and I had to drive separately, and I got there before her. Set up camp, and waited. And waited. I kept waiting and my friend never showed up. I was obviously concerned but wanted to stick around in case she did show up. I waited until morning and then finally packed up camp and got back into service range to find out what had happened. Now, this part of the story I wasn't there for since I was already on the land, but apparently my friend was driving around looking for the plot and she just could not find it no matter what. She definitely got there after me but said she didn't see my car anywhere or any signs that someone was on the land. I parked in a spot where no one would be able to miss me specifically so that she could find it easily. So, she kept driving around and started coming across all these ultra-religious creepy billboards that were warning about hell and damnation and all that fun stuff, which creeped her enough out that she turned around and just drove back home. Most people would think that she just went down the wrong road, and that is what I thought too until we reconnected later and went over the map, and she described the area. There was no way she wasn't in the right spot. The area she described perfectly matched where I was, and she went down all the right roads but somehow got teleported into a creepy religious nightmare. I've been in the area a lot and I've never seen anything like she was talking about with those billboards. I'm not sure which alternate reality she drove into, but I'm glad she made the decision to just drive home. When I went on a road trip to see my family in Texas, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get some coffee as it was about 2 a.m. I went inside, and there was a man at the counter smiling as normal. They didn't sell coffee, surprisingly, so I settled with an energy drink. I exited the store, got into my car, and drove off as you normally would. As soon as I left the parking lot of the dimly lit gas station, my gas tank was back on low, my energy drink was gone, as if it vanished out of the cup holder, and when I looked into my rearview mirror there was no gas station. I turned around and all there was Texas land. I still have no clue what happened to this day. Blackberries are prevalent in the pan, you just have to hit up some outskirts, old roads, train tracks, etc. We go pick it up every year because my partner's mother is generally in town in the fall and makes amazing homemade jams and pies. But I tend to get bored and drift, and I ended up in this little abandoned shack. Perhaps it was a one-room house once upon a time, but it's completely dilapidated. Inside was evidence people had squatted there through the years. Bottles and old clothing. A disgusting mattress. Also, about 40 decapitated Barbie dolls all over the floor. Missing limbs. Dirty and abused. Yes, I have photos, and if this garners any attention I'll get onto my computer after work and upload them. I should have called the police, but instead I ran and didn't really speak about it for months. I keep thinking I want to go back and see what's up, but it's just too creepy. My friends and I were going camping in the Ocala National Forest in Florida. It's miles upon miles of just woods out there, a few places here and there where people live but mostly just forest. We entered the National Forest area on a long road. The first thing I notice is a broken wooden sign that says, "Hell." We go on a bit further, our GPS is taking us down a road that it says will let out into another road and take us to the campsite. We go down the road and see some houses that have long driveways that appear to be built with the intention of being obscured from view. There are a few strange sculptures that look like large totems or something. Their appearance made me a bit uneasy. We get to the end of the road, and it doesn't let out. I see from what little of the houses are visible that there's people peeking out the windows at us, so we leave that place immediately and take a longer route to the campsite, a free primitive campground. Upon arrival there we saw people who looked like they lived there. One guy was using what appeared to be a crack pipe, and across from their sitting spot was a black hippie van-style van with a bumper sticker that said, "I masturbate." We decided that we would take a spot far from them and try our luck. We did bring a gun in case of emergency, and we reasoned that maybe if we stay to ourselves they will too. So, we found our spot and noticed a wooden cross in the ground. Not far from that we find a destroyed tent with clothes and food strewn about and what appears to be a trail where something was dragged off into the woods. We find another cross thrown on the ground a bit away, and as we poke around a bit more we see one of those totems built behind where those people were sitting. We decide to leave and go to a campground we have to pay for. Two of our friends left to buy firewood and they said they found a sign that said, "Free firewood," and followed it. They said they wound up in a shanty area with seemingly abandoned trailers and found nobody around. So, they decided to sit for a moment and see if they saw anyone. They said that someone looked out a window and just stared at them and they got scared and left. In the Ocala National Forest area there are a lot of places that give you an "I shouldn't be here" feeling. I have a few other stories from the area. This was just a brief version of our first excursion out there. Was on a road trip a few years back from QLD through to Broken Hill. We were trying to get to Burke by nightfall after being warned about rooms on the road at dusk, and we were in a fairly small car with no bulb, so being hit by a room was a real concern. By this point it's about 4:30 and we've been driving through the middle of nowhere for maybe an hour, with huge red anthills on either side of the road. It's getting dark and we want to speed up a bit and get to Burke because by this point we're all busting for the bathroom. Anyway, we speed up a bit, and that's where things get weird. We start losing kilometers on the dashboard, with the numbers heading downward, and gaining a tank of petrol. We pass these same anthills again, next to the same clump of trees. My dad suggested we took a turn at some point and looped back, so we dismissed it and kept going towards Burke straight. We get further than we did before and end up in this strange small town. It's 5:15 on a Friday and everything is completely shut. It's definitely dusk by now, but there are no lights on anywhere. We stop at the pub to use the toilets, but upon entry the pub is completely empty, although the television is on, just making a buzzing sound and displaying static. We're a bit freaked out, so we leave the pub, which had open doors but nobody inside, and head for the public toilets in the park. We go in and there's no lights inside, so we use the torchlights of our phone and find that all 3 cubicles are locked, though as far as we can tell, nobody is inside. We go back to the car and drive around looking for bathrooms. Though we can't find any others, and so we agree that we just really need to keep driving because we've booked a hotel already in Burke. We drive on the one road out of the town and just before we come to the sign saying, "You're leaving," we see a sheep on the road. It's pretty large and just stares at the car, and even after sitting there for a few minutes and honking it won't move. Eventually we just drive around it and go on our way. After that, the trip was pretty normal, but on the way back we made sure to go a different route. That town was just too creepy. I was driving back to San Francisco from Disneyland in the middle of the night with 2 friends. They were asleep, and I was doing my best to get us home. What should have been a 7-hour drive turned out to be a 10-hour drive due to construction, accidents, etc. It was around 1 in the morning, and we needed gas. This was in the middle of nowhere on I-5 about 45 minutes north of Grapevine. I pulled off the highway and into a brightly lit gas station. As I parked the car at the pump, I noticed that the ground appeared to be moving. I thought it was an illusion because it was late and I was very tired, so I woke my friends up. Is the ground moving?" I asked. "It's sure that it is," they both said at the same time. After a minute or two of our eyes adjusting to the brightly lit gas station, it became clear that the ground was completely covered in what I can only assume were locusts. What I had assumed was asphalt at first turned out to be insects. Millions of insects covering the ground as far as I could see. We turned the car back on and got the hell out of there as fast as we could and found another gas station about 10 miles further up the road. To this day, we still aren't sure it wasn't a shared hallucination. I've done minimal research on it and haven't found anything that would suggest this is a regular occurrence in California. I was in southern Alberta about 10 years ago and we went out to look at my grandma's school, now abandoned, from when she was a kid. It was in a field in the middle of nowhere, but it was big enough to have a gymnasium and looked to be about 8 to 10 classrooms, from back in the day when multiple grades would be in the same class, I believe. The door was boarded up, but it had been broken down. Inside the door were stairs going up to a long hallway of doors for classrooms and down going to the gymnasium. Gym was at ground level and the classrooms were above it. The classrooms were pretty freaky on their own since all the windows were boarded up too. We had a flashlight and looked around the whole upstairs. When we went back downstairs, the gym floor was all warped and cracked from water damage. It was like walking on rapids from a river with how warped the water damage made it. Off to the side of the gym was what looked like a cafeteria and a kitchen. It still had all the old cooking appliances inside. And a coffin. There was this big coffin on the floor in the middle of the kitchen. Looked like the kind you would see at any funeral home, probably made of rich mahogany. Maybe my young mind was playing tricks on me, but it looked like it was full of and surrounded by dry blood, and we noticed that the kitchen area looks recently used. It was at that point that my cousin got a bad feeling and basically pulled us out of this old building, and we took off in his car. Pretty scary now that I think about it. Once when the first band I played in were on our first tour, we did a West Coast tour from our hometown of Oakland, California to Seattle. We were on our way to Salem, Oregon. And we stopped at a gas station in a small town by empty Shasta after playing Chico. A young man, late teens/early 20s, walked up to me and asked me, "Are you here for the gathering?" I responded, no. "What gathering?" I then noticed that his eyes were completely black. I don't know if he was wearing contacts, or if he was a BEK, but in hindsight he acted like the latter because he had a blank look on his face and a deadpan emotionless tone in his voice. Plus, the way he blankly stared at me creeped me the F out. He didn't tell me any more about this gathering after my response to him, and my bandmates called for me to get back in the van to go. As I walked back to the van, the young man was following me about 5 feet behind me. I hastened my pace and hopped into the passenger seat, and he was standing right outside my door looking at me through the window. As we drove off, he reached out and touched the van, eerily similar to when the weird guy marked the van with a bloody handprint in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't know if he was an actual BEK, or just a crazy guy on drugs with black contacts, but that creeped me out for quite a while afterwards, to the point I would send my bandmates into the gas station to pick up whatever snacks/smokes I wanted and would stay in the van and not leave it. I've been an urban exploration enthusiast for about 10 years now. I've been in some remote places. I have literally hundreds of pictures from the gutted innards of the overgrown but indestructible Buckner building in Whittier, Alaska, and inside the subterranean viscera of others, the tunnel systems beneath SUU in Utah, underfoot thousands of people there for the annual Shakespeare Festival. But creepy? Scary? I'm not sure which would take the cake. I've spent quite a bit of time in Twin Arrows and Two Guns. Now, Twin Arrows is just an abandoned trading outpost, but Two Guns, now within the borders of Winslow, but still ostensibly haunted, probably takes the cake. It is, or was, as I'm not sure of its present state, known primarily as a ghost town, replete with abandoned swimming pools, derelict outposts, and water towers, and occasionally a half-deconstructed tower or two. But what disturbed me about Two Guns wasn't the more recent buildings that lay in partial ruin, it was the crevasses that, often without warning, seemed to open up beneath your feet with yawning, hungry mouths. Like sideways tunnels, they twisted and turned with jagged teeth, and if you shined a flashlight down them exactly right, you could almost see twinkling near the bottom. At first, I assumed they were abandoned mining projects, but if that were the case, why would they be so unmanicured? These were definitely natural formations, but more importantly, they were new. Yelling down into them was an act of strangeness. The echoes that came back up were distorted, flattened, hollow. My exploration partner, now deceased, unfortunately, not by natural causes, per Q, but certainly not supernatural either. This isn't a creepypasta, folks, and I decided to move along. Later down the road, there was a wider canyon, this one with wood planks spanning it. We thought it was better than attempting a crossing, but did climb a tower that allowed us a better view of the area. It was surreal. The brittle bones of several establishments built in various time periods were visible from this height, from the newer construction of water towers to the historic brick and adobe shells of the settlement before that. We left after perhaps 6 hours. I will never forget that trip. As I mentioned before, my exploration partner died 7 years ago. I love to visit strange, unique places when I travel. Last summer I went to Southeast Asia. My final leg of the trip was in Bangkok. In Bangkok I visited a strange department store that was stuck in the 60s. The employees look like they have been working there since that time. The only customer was me, and someone else I met traveling joined me. Everything was really old and full of dust. I tried to buy one item and they wouldn't sell it to me. I don't understand how this place makes money or how it is still open. After high school, my friend and I decided to go to Colorado to visit some of his friends since he was born there. We decided to explore a little on the way north and ended up on a mountain outside Colorado Springs. As we started up, we were surprised at how well maintained and yet seemingly overgrown the road was. Further up we end up having to squeeze up close to a cliff edge to make room for a military truck, 5-ton, which is slowly lumbering down. After it passes we shrug it off and continue up the mountain when we just run out of road. No wide spot, no clearing, just a wall of rock to one side and a cliff to the other. After a nerve-wracking 20,000-point turn we started back down, never finding a place where that truck could have turned around or come from. When I was 13, my family moved from Georgia to Washington State, drove the whole way. Took around 2 weeks. My parents, my younger sister, my 2 dogs, and a cat. It was hard enough to find a hotel that accepted dogs, but we usually had to sneak the cat in too. We'd been driving for hours in Colorado and found nothing, but at around 1 in the morning we came across a lit-up sign for a hotel. I remember talking to my mom about how weird it was, since it was rocky wasteland for hours around this sign, and it just came out of nowhere. I think the town was called Lima, but I'm not sure. I remember getting there and being blown away. It looked like something from a movie set in Vegas. There was a huge hotel with neon signs, a waiting room with a chandelier, fairly sure a casino. It was insane. And I remember that even though I was exhausted, I had this weird energetic feeling when we walked in. My parents were talking about how it would cost too much, but when they talked to the front desk it seemed like a pretty good price. They even said the dogs and the cat were okay. I just remember going to the room and passing out after that. When we woke up it looked like just an average hotel. If anything it was kind of run down. We all looked at each other like, what? It was so weird. We went around the town, and it was tiny and dirty. No big lights, not even any houses really. There were a few hotels and one gas station. It was so creepy. We all got a weird vibe. We got some gas and hightailed it out of there. Was in NC for a friend's birthday bonfire with a couple of other friends. Birthday boy's uncle is creepy and older and says, "Be careful about taking pictures. You'll be able to see the demons in the fire." Naturally all started taking photos. Ended up snapping one with this weird formation that looking like a flaming horned skull. We were all sending it to each other and trying to scare ourselves. Within an hour 2 people were throwing up and sick, no drugs no drinking. The birthday boy's girlfriend randomly dumped him and was acting weird. The police arrested the uncle for something to do with child support. And the family dog that had been chained up nearby to avoid the fire, and the driveway was run over by me even though the dog was way too big to get under my vehicle and the chain it had connected to its collar was unbroken. We all deleted the photos and left feeling like there was just a really dark air to the whole event. I have one for this. So I was in a small town, called Belton, in Missouri. I stopped for gas. The next week I was back and tried to go to that same gas station. But it was a CVS instead. When I looked it up, it said it had been a CVS for 5 years. I'm in Belton at least once a week because I live close to there, and I know it was the exact same location I had gotten gas the week before. This happened about 8 months ago, for context, and I still have no idea where that gas station went. This isn't anywhere near as good as most others here, but my dad and I were driving from Michigan to California on vacation one June. As we were painstakingly making our way across Nebraska, a giant thunderstorm was brewing, and we were driving into it. This was more western Nebraska. Eventually we decided it was getting too hairy to keep driving, and pulled off somewhere named Hershey, Nebraska. We went into pretty much the only thing we could find, which was a smaller truck stop with a dinner, I believe. We opened up the door to walk in, and like literally everyone that was there sort of stopped talking and stared at us. We lurked for a minute or two, deciding that it was ultimately weird, and were going to leave and see if there was anywhere less odd. As we drove further down the road, away from I-80, we passed 2 separate pickup trucks at stop signs. Both trucks had 2 people in them, and they were just staring at us. Not driving forward as they could have, being there was no traffic to wait for. Eventually booked it back to North Platte, which was a very friendly, quaint small town where we got to hang out with drunk Midwesterns who were all standing outside waiting to see tornadoes. Apparently that had had at least one in the area for like a week and a half straight at that point. I don't know. Either way, we're fairly sure there were some X-Files happening in Hershey. I went to college along the central coast of California, in San Luis Obispo to be exact. My friends and I heard that there was an abandoned, haunted asylum and we wanted to check it out. We researched it and apparently the accurate history of the building was an orphanage. Not an asylum. If you just Google San Luis Obispo Asylum a bunch of stuff will come up. So, us being college students, we wanted to go ahead and explore it, check it out, see just how haunted the place was. One of our friends had the brilliant idea to go at night, add them to the spooky feel. We got there, started exploring a bit. It was definitely creepy, definitely abandoned, and probably haunted. However, the unexplained story started about 20 minutes after we got there to explore. We were all walking around the perimeter of the building, looking for cool rooms to go into and rummage around in, pitch black, only using our phone flashlights as our sources of light. When we started hearing something pelting the walls near us. Originally we thought one of our friends had strayed from the group, but all 4 of us were accounted for, looking at each other in confusion. We all shushed each other and told each other to listen to see what that noise was, and at this point the fun, adolescent adrenaline of being young and exploring scary places was completely being overtaken by it definitely about to die to ghosts or crazy people adrenaline. As we listened, one of my friends suddenly shouted in pain with a big old ouch. What? And when we asked what happened, he said he just got hit by a rock, so that noise we were hearing was rocks being thrown at us at odd intervals from some unknown source. We waited for the next rock to be thrown, and as we caught a glimpse of the rock flying, we all aimed our flashlights at the location of where the rock came from. And there was nothing there. We were expecting to see an angry hobo or some other college kids trying to mess with us. But instead, we saw Jack. Absolutely nothing. As soon as we realized rocks were just flying at us with no one visible where the rocks were originally being thrown from, I must say that is the fastest I have ever seen a group of college kids run. We ran for our lives, and never looked back. We're all graduated now and doing well, but in the following years after that incident while we were still attending university, whenever the freshmen asked about the abandoned asylum, it's a pretty well-known rumor on the college campus that it's a haunted asylum, we would warn them that it's not worth it to go there. It's just an empty building, kind of just trying to convince these kids to not risk anything by going and checking it out like we did. Maybe during the day, it wouldn't be so bad. But definitely don't go there at night. I never went back to that godforsaken building, not even in the daytime. I call this my ghost house. We lived in rural Trail, Oregon for 20 years. To visit family up north we always drove the Tiller Trail Highway which brought us out on I-5 at Canyonville. It's a beautiful drive and we've taken it dozens of times. One of the first times we drove from Trail to Canyonville I saw a flash of a white house on the left side of the road. It was old and the yard and trees were overgrown but could have been inhabited at that point. It was on a bit of land next to the highway. From the brief glimpse I got I saw that it was set in some really thick, tall Douglas fir trees and I remember thinking that house would not get a lot of sunlight in winter. On the way back from that same trip I looked for that house and could not see it. Pretty much forgot about it a few months later and specifically looked for it again and still couldn't find it. After that it got to be a hide and go seek thing since sometimes I'd see a flash of it and sometimes not. The family thought I was nuts. Finally started diligently paying attention and spotted it and figured it out. Only the dark of winter when the leaves were gone from the trees and a certain time of day when the sun cut through those dense fir trees, the house was briefly visible. During the spring and summer when everything was leafed out it disappeared again behind the green. And it was only visible if you were heading towards Canyonville. Not in the other direction, and only at a certain time of day in winter. But truly, I kind of wish it were a time-shifting ghost house. Think of the stories. My sister, 2 stepbrothers and I used to run around in the forest heaps with Nerf guns and laser tag equipment, super fun. We knew the area pretty well, it was pretty flooded, at some point we had to cut down some old dead trees to make a bridge to get over the water. We were exploring for a few hours straight when we came across this grove of dead trees. In the middle was a perfectly set up table, 2 chairs and tea set. We lived in a pretty rural area, and like I said, it was pretty much marshland due to flooding and was extremely hard to get to this area. It was creepy, it made me feel really uncomfortable. The trees had grown so tight together that I didn't know how a table could have been moved there, we had to break a lot of branches to get there. We left and came back the next day. My stepbrother marked the path with his pocketknife so we could find it again. We found it again, but the tea set was gone along with one of the chairs. We didn't go back after that. This is my mom's story. This was about 1996 to 1997 in California on a highway, either 5 or 101, on a long desolate stretch. Which makes my mom believe it was 5. We were coming from Southern California and going back home to Northern California. My sister was 2 or 3 and I was 3 or 4, and we were asleep in the back seat. My mom says that she was on the road with a few cars. Off in the distance and in the sky, there was a shiny object hovering. She figured it was tethered somehow. As she was getting closer, an increase of cars was getting off at exits. She could see that it was silver and round and it didn't seem to be tethered but still figured out that it must be. More and more cars got off until it was just her and another car, and she was close enough at this point, she could see underneath it, to see that the object was not tethered to the ground in any way, it was hovering 2, it was completely silent 3, it was a silver metal aircraft 4, there was an airplane stuck to the bottom of it. This was after about a half an hour of driving towards it. she was terrified to stop and document it or study it more. She wanted to film it, she had the camcorder, but was too afraid to pull off to the side of the road and be left behind by the other car. My mom rarely talks about this. She is not a conspiracy theorist, doesn't believe in alien contact, the paranormal, or anything like that. My grandfather, who we had visited on that trip, was an army colonel, and my mom didn't even want to bring it up to him because she thought he'd think she was insane. No explanation. There was this one really weird kid in high school who wasn't necessarily strange, just always managed to get into trouble somehow and had a bad family history. Anyways, one night he invited a bunch of people from school over to his grandfather's property to have a bonfire and drink beer. I showed up a little late and one of my friends dropped a pin into the fire. The property was way down some back roads in rural AL, and when I finally arrived I saw the fire and pulled up, but also noticed an extremely old-looking house on the property. After drinking for a while, my friend who invited us started explaining that the old house has always been there and that there was an insanely creepy basement in the house. We decided to all go in, but I immediately knew something was up when he said we couldn't use the front door. We all had to climb through a broken window because the place was locked up tight. The whole house smelt of mildew and rotting wood, but he showed us the entrance to the basement. It was extremely dark and had the old-style concrete stairs with an exceptionally low roof. Once we got down inside the basement, it was more like a storm shelter that was placed under the house, but I'll never forget how small it was, with the height of it being probably only 5 feet. The part that made it so creepy was an indented shelf into the concrete, as if it was some kind of alteration. My buddy also closed up the door that led from the stairs into the basement, and we all sat there for only about 3 minutes with our cell phone flashlights on before we got the hell out of the house. Scariest part is, while we left I was the last out of the basement, and I'll never forget the feeling of something almost tugging at me. Utterly terrifying and totally ruined my night. I left soon after the experience. I don't really have any particular stories about things happening to me as much as visiting places that are spooky/haunted. I live in Connecticut, which is notoriously historic, so it comes with the territory, I suppose. I live in a small town of about 9,000 residents. And in our own town we have an abandoned psychiatric hospital/behavioral health institute, as well as the remnants of a Nike missile launch site. You can see the Nike site here, and I found a video of someone going through the Elm Crest Hospital here. One town over we have CVH, Hospital for the Insane. It has many old buildings that have been boarded up, but some are still in use. Even more popular is the cemetery of unmarked graves off a dirt path surrounding the hospital. They have since put up a memorial with names to try to end scrutiny, if nothing else. You can drive these dirt roads and feel like you're just driving in circles. It feels like you might not come out. My fiancé feels uncomfortable every time we drive past this place. And when we went to visit the cemetery, he wouldn't get out of the car. There are historically and presently allegations of abuse, and you can feel it just being there. I wish I had more of my own photos, but here is what I have, and you can see more here. Some places exist for a noticeably brief time. I lived on a small rundown farm as a child. Down the hill in the pasture there was a swampy area that tractors couldn't go in, and it was filled with briar that formed a bit of a maze. It was maybe the size of a football field. I had found my way through the left side of the maze, but for years wondered what was on the right. From the hill above you could see the briars opened up in the middle, and there were a couple of standing dead trees as well. But I could never find my way into the right side of the maze. Left and right as I faced the area from our house. One winter, with a few inches of snow on the ground and the swamp mostly frozen, I tried for the right side. It helped that I was protected from briars by a down jacket and I had doubled up on pants. I pushed my way through using a stick to hold down some briars and got into the center of the maze. What I found was amazing. A springhead bubbled up with warm groundwater. For 6 feet around the spring there was long green grass and no snow. There were a lot of deer and rabbit footprints in the thicket. I couldn't tell you how they got in and out of the place. It was the most serene thing I have ever witnessed. For years later they developed the farm, and I watched a giant rubber tire loader with a mower attachment through the swamp destroying the maize. I watched in horror as I had avoided returning to the spring because it was too precious. I am certain the storm water management killed the spring and dried up the swamp. They call this progress. Creepy shut down ski resort story, Bombeck Nowhere, VT. I was tired looking for a hotel. I came upon some ski resort, it's August, with no signs but lit up. There were no staff, just hundreds of Hasidic Jews everywhere doing some convention. A hippie, me, dressed like a hippie, got so many stares from the men I didn't feel safe at all. I noted and found a Best Western down the road 15 minutes and so tired later. I know it isn't the type of story looked for, but Hasidic families by the hundreds in central Vermont threw me off a bit. When I was in middle school in the late 90s I got really into model rockets. Living in the city, there aren't too many places you can shoot them off and expect to get them back. So, my friend and I scooped out a few spots on our bikes and came across an abandoned neighborhood development. Like the roads were poured and everything, but they gave up actually building any houses, so lots of open space. So we go back to my house, keeping track of landmarks to find it again. Old mobile service station, dollar store, Texas Hammer billboard. So, we get my rocket stuff, and a skateboard because we are going to be stupid, and have my stepdad drive us back. And we find it easy, like 10 minutes or so away. We shoot off some rockets, strap some engines to that skateboard to see if it will rocket off, it doesn't, and have a wonderful time. It is late and I'm out of engines, so we head back. A week later, I got more engines and a new rocket, so we decided to go back and shoot some more. We ride on our bikes around for 2 hours, never find it. We backtrack over and find nothing. No turn-off road, no suddenly erected fence, nothing. So, we went back to my house and had my stepdad drive us again. He can't find it. I look every so often just to see if maybe I will find it again for years after until we moved away. Never did. Somewhere in the desert driving from CO to CA. Stopped at a normal-looking gas station off the highway late at night. There were maybe 2 to 3 cars parked there, I was the only one getting gas. Went in to pee, restroom was down this kind of weirdly lit long white hall and I accidentally went the other way at first. Instead of the restroom I encountered a bouncer in front of an open door. I look past him through the door and there is a bustling, dimly lit casino with 50 to 100 old people inside playing slots. I look at the bouncer, he shakes his head, no. I ask for the restroom, he points the other way down the hall. I passed, went back to the car, considered waking up my friends to show them, but ultimately drove away. I looked at the gas station as I left and couldn't see any part of the structure that looked big enough to hold a casino, but it could have just been the angle. I didn't drive in a circle around the gas station, just got on the highway, and the casino had a low ceiling. There was definitely not a lit parking lot or enough cars to fit all those old people anywhere in sight, though. Were you driving on US 50? The loneliest road in America? This question by OP makes me think of stopping on that road about 10 years ago at the Utah/Nevada border at the only gas station/cafeteria/motel you find at that location. If a person were to drive to that spot, it's the only place there. You can't miss it. Going inside felt like walking into the Twilight Zone. I didn't see any sign of people living near there, but there were about 10 people at the lunch counter. Where were their cars parked because I didn't see this many cars outside? No one was younger than 60. People were side-eyeing me, and I even caught an obvious scowl or two. Everyone knows that feeling of showing up somewhere and feeling like you don't belong and it's better if you leave. I had that feeling there and I was in and out. I remember thinking hate this place as I drove off. I could very easily see that experience explained as that building being some kind of illegal casino because all of the details didn't add up. Why would the place be busy when there was zero traffic on the road? There were no obvious places that people would be living at to come over for a cup of coffee, so who were these people and where were their vehicles? Strange place, that Highway 50 through Nevada. There used to be a cowboy apparel store near the expressway by me. It was there for as long as I can remember, but I never saw any cars parked outside it or anything like that. Being that cowboy apparel isn't exactly popular where I live, I wasn't surprised that nobody ever visited there. I decided to go inside one day out of curiosity, and it was nothing special. It was just like a clothing store except more cowboy hats and less shorts. While I was there, which was only for a couple minutes to look around, I didn't see any workers or employees, which was nice since I didn't want anyone asking about my leather boot preferences. I left the store and never went back. A year or so later, I found out it burned down. I drove past the area where it was, and sure enough, there was the charred carcass of a once standing cowboy apparel store. Well, I told some friends and family about it, and they said they had never heard of or seen this place. I told them it was the one right by the expressway, and they said they had never seen it. They told me that area of land had always been empty. I asked some other people and coworkers, and they all said the same thing. I started getting a bit sketched out, so I googled it and couldn't find a single thing about it burning down. Hell, I couldn't even find any evidence of the place existing in the first place. I drove back with a friend of mine, and it looked like nothing was there in the first place. It was like a building that was never erected there at all, let alone one that caught fire. It was just green grass like everywhere else surrounding the area. I know it had to have existed since I walked around inside of it, but nobody but me seems to even realize it was there at all. So not creepy or anything, but just over a year ago me and my girlfriend were on holiday in Tenerife. As the hotel's night entertainment was shocking, we went out most nights, British bars, small pubs/bars and the like. One particular night we walked in a different direction to the usual, and as we rounded a corner we heard some kind of house music blaring from a bar above us. We decided to go up the stairs to it and see what it was like. The place was decorated extremely nightclub sequel with LEDs and strobes on every solid surface you could see, not our usual place to be as we don't really like busy places, but this place was dead, strange considering it was a 5 minutes walk from the main strip. Including us and the girl in the bar, there were 5 people in the entire place. One strange thing to me was the other couple that were there. The lady had to have been in her 70s and the man with her about 20s, and he was all over her, like a honeymoon couple. I know, age is just a number, beauty eye beholder and all that, but simply weird. Regardless, we enjoyed our night and made plans to come back the next night as the music was good, and drinks were cheap. So, on came the next day and we got ourselves so excited to return to this bar, ate our tea and set off to the bar, got to the point where it was, couldn't hear music, started to walk up the stairs and the bar wasn't there. The building was there, but instead of it being open plan with plastic wind curtain things outside, it was all bricked up. We had walked up these stairs towards someone's house front. Needless to say, the people who were around didn't give us any funny looks. We walked up and down this street as we just couldn't believe this place didn't exist. If it weren't for us both remembering it, and me taking a video of the inside, I'd have thought it was a dream. So yes, not creepy but just baffling. A few places. Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center over in Poughkeepsie, New York. Easily one of the creepiest places I've ever been nearby. Have a few friends who snuck inside of it after the fire, and they told me is disturbing. One friend told me that you would go into one room and there would be nothing but those old-style school desks, like the room was just filled with like 60 of these things. Not stacked or anything, just pushed inside. Then you'd go into another room, and it was spotless. I mean white glove treatment, spotless for absolutely no reason since the place is abandoned, aside from a small wing that was still in operation when I delivered pizza to the joint about 7 or 8 years ago. Just ignore that place all the way around. Onion Town, New York. Locals are only allowed in the area or else they'll attack you. My friend Andrew drove there to check it out one day and he came back with a dented hood and a smashed windshield. They don't play around. When I was a kid, I lived in a town called Fishkill, New York. I used to live in a housing development in the area, cheap for back then townhouses where 2 or 3 houses were attached together at the wall. When I was a kid, me and my best friend at the time went into the woods behind his house. We climbed down a steep hill and there was this bog-like pond in the middle of the woods. As we got closer to it we saw in the distance a super old-looking house, smack dab in the middle of the woods with nothing around it, but if I recall, one of the windows was illuminated. From the angle we were at, we could see there was nothing on the other side of the house. Freaked us and we booked it back up to his house. Mind you, all 3 of these places are in the middle of nowhere upstate rural New York. This is the suburbs, only like an hour to an hour and a half outside of NYC. Still in southern Hudson Valley in Dutchess County. About 40 years ago or so, my dad lived in the northeast part of Romania where there are a lot of older monasteries, and being a huge fan, he became an architect. He would go out to visit them when he had free time. One time he wanted to go visit a monastery out in the hills. The bus had taken him to a larger village nearby, but he had a little hiking to do still. On the way there, he had to pass through another smaller village. In the smaller village he ran into a weird procession. One man was carrying a huge mirror, another was beating a drum, and a number of people from the village were walking behind them, all of it completely silent, aside from the drum, and dead serious. It was probably a completely harmless local custom, but it freaked him out. I'm from Indiana. One day, while walking around in an abandoned building in my town, me and my friends all thought we heard and saw a man with a beard walking around. Not unusual. Homeless people are everywhere. After going deeper, the room we heard the noise in was absolutely packed with junk and covered in spiderwebs. No one could have moved around in there. We scoured the entire building and found no such man. We went back to double-check the room we heard the noise from and discovered a door. We moved the stuff to get to the door. It opened to a small closet. On the wall, drawn in the dust, was a heart. It was clear enough to take a picture, but shortly after my phone was broken, and I couldn't recover anything. This little heart meant a lot to me. My girlfriend had a family member that was close to her who was born with a backwards heart. They did the surgeries required as a young child, but they were unable to fully develop. She died at 21 or 22. Every year, they give heart-shaped presents. Her family really believes that when they see hearts it's her telling them that she's okay up in heaven. I thought it was just me. But all 4 of us saw and heard it. And to see that heart, it was unexplainable. When I was around 12 years old, my dad, my brother, and I were heading home from a hockey game. We had a ride there and back with a friend of mine and his dad. We had parked our car in a church about 2 miles from our house, as it was in between both of our houses and a convenient meeting spot. We pull into the church at about midnight, and we get out of our friend's truck to get into ours. Right as they pull out of the parking lot, the entire sky lights up in green as if it were lighting, but with a deep green color. This lighting happened about 5 or 6 times. My dad, my brother, and I could not figure out what was going on, so we just left. We started to drive home and realized that we had not seen any other traffic and all the stop lights were blinking red. Which is a bit unusual. Now, the scariest part of this story is the next day my friend and his dad were over, and we asked about the green lightning, which they say they did not see. We also asked about the stop lights blinking red, to which again they said all the lights were working fine even though we use mostly the same route home. I've never been there, but Dudley Town, CT is a popular haunted/spooky destination. There was what I assume is an old wives' tale I heard in my 20s. I'm sure other CT natives have heard a variation of this, or it wouldn't surprise me if this is really from a horror movie I've never seen, that went as follows. A couple of guys went to visit Dudley Town. It's private and closed off now. Trespassing fines start at $75, so you've got to sneak in. After exploring and getting a little spooked out, one guy decided to take a rock the size of a baseball home with him as a souvenir. He left it on top of the dresser in his bedroom. In the middle of that first night, he woke up with a horrible nosebleed. The second night, the same thing happened, middle of the night, and he wakes up to a gusher of a nosebleed. The third night, no difference. Once again he wakes up in the middle of the night to find his nose bleeding. He went to the doctor that day, but immediate tests found nothing. The fourth night it happens again. The next day he discusses it with one of his friends who went to Dudley Town with him, and the friend mentions the rock. The nosebleed victim freaked out and they decided to drive back up to Dudley Town and throw the rock back into the forest. Sure enough, you guessed it, that night the nosebleeds stopped and never happened again. If you Google Dudley Town you'll find some entertaining spooky stories. Well, this is a happy unexplained story, rather than a creepy one. It happened when I was in high school. Circa 1999, back before I had a cell phone, and certainly before I had a smartphone. I wish I could have taken a picture. But part of me feels like maybe I somehow wouldn't have been allowed to have this experience if I had had a camera with me. I was walking my dog in some woods near my house. I was pretty familiar with them, as my dog and I went there often. One day, I came to an enormous clearing that I had never seen before, like a giant field, smack in the middle of the woods, and it was entirely blanketed with yellow daffodils. Thousands and thousands of them. My dog loved it and romped and frolicked in the daffodils as I took in the beauty and felt completely awed. Like I was witnessing something magical. No one else was around, and it felt really special, like the experience was just for me. I went back the next day. I searched and searched, but I could not find that clearing, nor a single daffodil. I drove through this town called Minden, West Virginia on the way to some serious whitewater rafting at the Gauley River in WV. While driving through the town on the way in it just seemed like an odd place and gave off a very haunted vibe. This was in the middle of the day and the place just screamed, "Do not stop here." We saw a couple town folk wandering around and they looked harmless enough. After our rafting adventures, the next day we camped at some sites near the river and hung out with the tour guides. They implored us to not stop in the town and made it clear it was not safe for visitors. We didn't really understand why, but they refused to explain further other than just to say it's not safe. On our way out we again drove through the town and saw one guy carrying a snake across his body and playing with it very nonchalantly, one guy with horrible facial disfigurements and one other person missing a lot. Assume it was some kind of mining accident. We start looking up stuff about Minden as soon as we get cell phone reception, and apparently it has a population of 250 and nearly every person in the town has had cancer or knows someone that does. The EPA is doing some serious soil testing to see what's going on, and the townspeople are resigned to the thought that they pretty much live in a toxic wasteland. Dyer Lane, near Sacramento, California. I was a senior back in high school and always looking for trouble at the time. Me and some friends heard about the haunted road from a teacher one day and decided to check it out for ourselves that weekend. After doing some research and seeing those multiple fatal accidents and a murder that happened on that road, I was quite nervous about going. We all piled into 2 cars and set out for the 30-minute drive to get to the road. The drive there was pretty normal, just a bunch of 2-lane country roads. As soon we got close to taking a right turn to get onto Dyer Lane, I began feeling a sense of dread and a sense of impending doom. We turn right and get on the road. With our brights on we can already see the road graffitied up, and also nearby trees were also tagged with satanic signs and whatnot. Already having a creepy vibe from this, I start to look out into the pitch dark tree line and notice a rope hanging from a tree, or what I thought at least. At that point I wanted nothing to do with being on that road and argued with my friend saying we needed to turn around and leave. My mind was going into full panic, and I was shaking uncontrollably. I refused to look out of the window anymore and dreaded every moment we were on that road. We went down and back without seeing another car, and there were no streetlights, so it was pitch black. Hate that place. Never went back and have never felt those feelings like I did that night. Near where I grew up, there's a state park my family would go to fairly often. It's got a couple hiking trails, and since we grew up going there, I know those trails pretty well. As teenagers, my sisters and I started exploring off the trails, trying to find interesting things in the wooded area they went through. Once, rather close to the start of the trail, we took a sharp left away from the path, and within a few minutes, we found a small cemetery. It had a couple dozen headstones, overgrown with vines, but still readable, and a wrought iron fence around it. Later attempts to find this location turned up nothing. When I told my dad about it, he thought he knew where it was, but when he led us to where he was looking, all there were a couple of cornerstones from what was most likely an old cabin. It didn't even remotely match the description we gave, but he insisted that had to be it, and that there were no cemeteries lost in the woods. This was long ago. I must have been somewhere between 8 to 10. It seems like a fever dream when I think about it, which isn't very often. Must have been during the summer in the swamps of Louisiana, because my memory of the time is bright, orange, and brown. In a fishing boat taking what I guess was a sightseeing trip along the waters. The adult piloting the boat pulls over to a small weather-worn dock, and he, my friend, and I get out of the boat. Not sure why we docked, but I saw an old, abandoned church among the trees, so I decided to investigate. Windows broken, pews and altar still intact, nothing is painted, and dead leaves cover the ground. I saw a door that led to a back room, and in that room another door. Upon going through that second door, I was in a small rectangular room with light coming through weather-worn cracks in the wood. I'm not sure why, maybe a trick of the light mixed with the dying flowers, but on the back wall was something that looked like a great elongated dying sunflower on the back wall. After looking at it for a short while, I had a sudden urgency to return to the boat, but not out of danger. I remember the sun searing my eyes once I crossed the open church doors. Everyone got back into the boat, and nothing was said. So, I was doing an outside sales job a few years back, and the town of Klamath Falls, Oregon, population 21K, was in my territory. There was a customer there who also had an office in the nearby rural town of Chiloquin, Oregon, population 730, and I seemed to always be visiting when he was at the Chiloquin location. One day I decided to drive out there even though it wasn't technically in my territory. Another rep handled that area, though I was sure he never went out there, not much reason to. On my way into town, I noticed a small thrift store with vinyl records in the window. I made a mental note to stop on my way out of town. I visited with the customer, which was great, and as I was driving back I remembered to stop in that shop. It was a very odd-looking building with a really weird rock facade on one side and a few small windows on the other. As I attempted to go into what I thought was the front door, a little old man popped out of a side door and beckoned me to come down to that entrance. I walked into a room that contained his kitchen area and a dog bed with a dog on it. To the left behind a curtain, I assumed was his bedroom area, and to the right was the thrift/antique store. The place was very poorly lit and cluttered with a lot of antiques, junk. I told him that I had come looking for some vinyl, and he directed me to a corner with some milk crates full of old records. I sifted through for 5 or 10 minutes looking for a treasure. Up to this point I had not had a single red flag, or anything go off in my brain. He then approached me and told me that he had some more vinyl in the back. I followed him down a different hallway than the one I came in, and it was pitch black. It was at this moment that my spidey senses began to tingle. He turned a corner and flipped on a light, and sure enough there were more milk crates with a lot more vinyl. I was cautious, but at this point I thanked him and began to hunt. A minute or two in, every hair on my body stood on end and my stomach sank. He had set a record. The song was "No More I Love Yous" by Annie Lennox. The sound system was extremely lo-fi and muffled sounding. This is perhaps the creepiest song this man could have chosen to play at this particular moment. Up to this point we had talked briefly about classic rock, Beatles, Zepp, The Who, Queen, so putting this song on made no sense and legitimately made me fear for my life. It was then that I realized that no one knew where I was. My company knew I was in Klamath Falls and so did my wife, but I hadn't told anyone that I was going any further. I was convinced that the owner was going to come around the corner with a gun or knife in his hand. In fact, I could almost see it happening in front of me. It took me a few moments to muster up the courage to very cautiously make my way to the hall, back to the main part of the store and to my vehicle. I've never been so convinced in my life that I was going to be murdered. When I was in 6th grade, some friends and I broke into a big house that had been empty for years. Every room we went into was full of dusty old model planes hanging from the ceiling and on the floors where they fell. There were hundreds of them. A couple of days after that, all the windows were boarded up and no trespassing signs were put up. I don't honestly know how well this is going to fit in here, but during the summer I like to go fishing. I love to see the waves, feel the breeze, and take it all in. I always go fishing in the ocean, and I live in Maine on the East Coast. Anyways, this must have been last summer. I went fishing with my cousin, let's say Andrew, and we would set up our rods on the surf and go fishing from there. We typically set everything up before the sun is down. I can't remember exactly why, but Andrew had to go home early one day, and he was the one with the car, but I decided to stay behind to continue fishing. It was a fairly good night so far, already landed one fish. And I couldn't stop it there, right? It must have been 40 minutes after sunset he left, and all of the last streams of light were disappearing from the sky as the moon lit up the beachhead around me, so I went back to my seat. I sat up and with my lamp started to read my book. The moon was full and the sky full of stars around me, the ocean shimmering, and still it was beautiful. Not another soul on the beach at this time of night. During the day there's a few people that will walk by, and it's not uncommon to see another fisher while you're on the beach. An hour or so passes by and I haven't had a hit on my rod in the longest time, so I decide to switch the type of bait I'm using to something different, so I bring my tackle down to the surf and begin to reel in one of my rods, and while I'm standing ankle deep in the cold Atlantic, I see someone standing hunched down in the surf maybe 60 or so odd meters away from me. Being me, I was a little shocked I didn't notice this person before. There is one typical entrance to the beach where everyone who wants to see the ocean goes through, which is right near where I have my seat and lamp set up. So, I anchor my rod and decide to start to wave and try to see who it is. I started to walk over, and as I got closer and closer it looked almost like a child/young kid from their height, just looking face down into the shallow water. I continued to walk and call to him, her concerned admittedly at this point for this kid. But as I got closer and in the moonlight, instead of seeing a shirt and whatnot, they were covered in these gray scales, gray shiny scales. I saw on its back a spine like a fish with long quills coming out and webbing connecting them. I was maybe 15 feet away from it at this point. And by the time I realized this, it was too late. I stood there as it began to get up where a human's face I thought would be. There was a snout like a dog and big black eyes like a shark. With those eyes it looked over at me and I ate it. I stood there perfectly still as it began to look up at the sky, opened its mouth and let out a horrifying sound. I'm not sure best how to describe that sound. I have never heard nor hopefully will ever again hear anything even like it. It sounded hurt in some strange way. And just like that it waded its way back out into the waves and into the ocean. Amboy, California. It is a very creepy ghost town, which is basically just a rundown hotel and gas station that were abandoned long ago. It's in an oddly empty place, but will travel to part of the desert if that makes sense. There is some traffic heading to Joshua Tree National Park and lots of evidence of people, but it is very empty. What little properties we could see along the highway were all surrounded by tall fences and razor wire. While I've never had an experience out there, I have heard stories of cults, kidnapping, and seeing other weird thing that only seems to happen in the desert. I know I will never go there again. It's incredibly unsettling, even during the day. So, one day when I was around 12 or 13, my brother and I were hiking around the woods behind our house, and we got lost. Now, we've been all around these woods hundreds of times. We never got lost and we always knew how to get home. My brother was scared about being lost and started running, trying to get back to familiar territory. I followed him and we came into this clearing that had an old wooden house. It had a red tin roof, and car hubcaps on the sides. There was barbed wire around in the yard. Keep in mind we have never seen this house before. Hundreds of times, we explored these woods. My brother was like, we should go ask them if they have a phone. I had seen enough horror movies, specifically Wrong Turn, with creepy cabins in the woods and I was not having it. I refused and at about that time we heard some dogs bark, and we ran. Not even 5 minutes later we were back at the house. We have since tried to find the cabin and even a few years later a logging company came and cut down the whole forest. There it was nothing that even remotely could have looked like the cabin. We still get chills talking about almost 15 years later. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had knocked. When I was 13 years old I remember going into an old gas station with some of my friends. We were all out on a day trip to a river near a small town in southern Missouri. We all went in and got some food because the river was quite a way away from our houses. So, we left and had our day out at the river. Later, when we were going back to our houses, we passed where that gas station was and I swear to God, the entire place was abandoned, and it looked like it had been for several years. I'm talking windows broken and covered with dust, doors broken in, signs on the floor. I was the only one who noticed it when we passed. My friends think I'm insane for it. I was traveling once late at night after a concert from Whitewater, Wisconsin to Kenosha, Wisconsin. Most of this route is country roads. As I'm driving up a hill, everything is dark around me and my 1999 Cavalier's headlights were not helping. A completely nude man runs up to my car, screaming and banging on my doors to let him in. Terrified, my 18-year-old self speeds away and calls my boyfriend for help. I ended up calling 911 for the guy, and they never found anyone or any traces of people. Still freaks me out to this day to drive alone at night. When my husband and I were house hunting I came across a bank-owned house, foreclosure, that was dirt cheap. We drove out to check it out and immediately after our feet hit the property grounds overwhelming despair came over us. It felt like sadness and suicide. But we forged on. The weeds reached almost to the roof. Most of the windows were boarded. The feelings of dread continued. Peering in one of the bedroom windows, there appeared to be something splattered and smeared all over the wall. Almost streaked. Couldn't tell if it was blood or feces. The more we saw the more we understood the feelings of despair. The place just reeked of bad juju. There was a scent permeating from the house that smelled like death and meth had a baby. Without communicating any of this aloud, we both booked it for our car. Jumping in like the hounds of hell were nipping at our heels. And just sat there shivering from the heebie-jeebies. We were there less than 10 minutes.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.